There are killers driven by greed. There are killers driven by rage. And then there are killers whose motives are so quietly disturbing, so incomprehensible to those who've never stood at the edge of desperation, that they force us to ask questions we'd rather not answer. Welcome to Dark Case Files. I'm your host, and before we enter one of Victorian England's most unsettling murder cases, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. The cases we cover here reveal the darkest truths about human nature and the societies that shape it. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. This story takes place in industrial Manchester, but its horror speaks to something universal about the breaking point of the human mind. Today, we're traveling to Manchester, England, in the year 1887, to the smoky, cramped slums where poverty and disease were constant companions, to a small home where a mother's exhaustion turned into something far more sinister, to a crime that shocked Victorian Britain and forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about motherhood, mental health, and desperation. This is the true story of Elizabeth Berry, a mother, a wife, and a poisoner whose calm confession would haunt everyone who heard it. Manchester, 1887. The Industrial Revolution has transformed England into the world's economic powerhouse. But that transformation has come at a terrible human cost. In cities like Manchester, factories dominate the landscape, belching black smoke that turns the sky perpetually gray. Workers live in cramped, unsanitary housing, laboring 12-hour days for wages that barely keep them alive. Infant mortality is staggering. In Manchester's poorest neighborhoods, nearly half of all children die before their 5th birthday. Disease spreads rapidly through the crowded tenements. Cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis death is everywhere, and the poor bear its burden most heavily. In this harsh environment, motherhood is both a blessing and a curse. Children are needed to work, to earn, to support aging parents. But raising them is exhausting, expensive, and heartbreaking. Many women spend their entire adult lives pregnant or caring for small children, watching helplessly as some of those children inevitably die. Into this world was born Elizabeth Berry (née Wright) in 1857. Little is recorded about her early life, but we know she came from a working-class family in the Oldham area near Manchester. She married Thomas Berry in 1877 when she was 20 years old. Thomas worked as a factory laborer, and by all accounts, they were a typical working-class couple struggling but managing. Between 1877 and 1886, Elizabeth gave birth to 5 children. 3 died in infancy or early childhood, causes attributed to the usual suspects: fever, respiratory illness, and natural deaths that were so common no one questioned them. By 1887, Elizabeth had 2 surviving children, 8-year-old Edith and 11-month-old Harriet. The family lived at 1 Back George Lee Street in Oldham, a narrow terraced house in one of the poorest sections of the city. The house had 3 small rooms, no running water, and shared outdoor toilets with several other families. It was dark, damp, and perpetually cold. Thomas Berry worked long hours at the factory, coming home exhausted and irritable. Money was always tight, and Elizabeth spent her days caring for the children, doing washing for neighbors to earn a few extra shillings, and trying to stretch their meager resources to cover food, coal, and rent. Neighbors later described Elizabeth as quiet and withdrawn. She didn't socialize much, didn't attend church regularly, and seemed perpetually exhausted. Some said she looked older than her 30 years, worn down by hard work and constant worry. But no one suspected she was capable of murder. She was just another poor mother struggling to survive, and in 1887 Manchester, there were thousands of women exactly like her. On January 4th, 1887, Elizabeth walked into John Fletcher's chemist shop on Yorkshire Street in Oldham. She approached the counter and asked for a bottle of gripe water, a common. Victorian remedy for infant colic and teething pain. It was a mixture of dill seed oil, sodium bicarbonate, and water, considered safe and effective for babies. The chemist's assistant, a young man named Walter Stanway, prepared the bottle as requested. But in the chaos of a busy shop, he made a terrible mistake. Instead of reaching for the gripe water, he grabbed a bottle of zinc sulfate solution, a poisonous substance used for external applications only. The bottles looked similar, and in his haste, he didn't check the label carefully. He handed the bottle to Elizabeth, who paid her pennies and left. She had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. The bottle looked like what she'd purchased before, and she trusted that the chemist knew what he was doing. But some part of what happened next suggests that Elizabeth may have suspected or discovered that something was wrong with what she'd been given, because what she did with that bottle would destroy her family and end her own life. Elizabeth returned home with the bottle. It was late afternoon, and baby Harriet was crying a constant, exhausting wail that grated on Elizabeth's nerves. The 11-month-old had been teething and colicky for weeks, rarely sleeping more than an hour or two at a time. Elizabeth was exhausted beyond measure, functioning on broken sleep and frayed nerves. According to her later testimony, she gave Harriet a dose of what she believed was gripe water. The baby stopped crying briefly, but soon started again, even more distressed than before. What happened in the next few hours remains unclear, and Elizabeth's own account is confused and contradictory. But what we know for certain is this. By 9 p.m. that evening, neighbors heard terrible screams coming from the Barry household. Mrs. Sarah Holt, who lived next door, rushed over to see what was wrong. She found Elizabeth standing in the kitchen, looking dazed, holding baby Harriet in her arms. The baby was limp, her lips blue, her breathing shallow and labored. "She won't stop crying," Elizabeth said, her voice flat and distant. "I gave her the medicine, but she won't stop." Mrs. Holt immediately saw that the baby was desperately ill. She told Elizabeth to fetch a doctor immediately. Elizabeth seemed to move in slow motion, as if she didn't quite understand what was happening. Eventually, Mrs. Holt had to send her own son to find Dr. James Patterson, who lived a few streets away. Dr. Patterson arrived within 20 minutes. But by then, it was too late. Baby Harriet died in his arms as he examined her. She had been dead less than 5 minutes when he arrived. Dr. Patterson immediately suspected poisoning. The symptoms, the blue lips, the convulsions Mrs. Holt described, the rapid deterioration, were consistent with toxic ingestion. But when he questioned Elizabeth about what the baby had eaten or drunk, she seemed confused and unable to answer coherently. She kept repeating, "I gave her the medicine, the gripe water. I only wanted her to stop crying." Dr. Patterson asked to see the bottle. Elizabeth handed it to him. He uncorked it, smelled it, and immediately recognized that it was not gripe water. The sharp, metallic smell was unmistakable. This was zinc sulfate, a poison. Dr. Patterson asked Elizabeth where she had obtained the bottle. She told him about the chemist on Yorkshire Street. He asked if she had realized it was the wrong medicine. Elizabeth's response was chilling in its ambiguity. I thought it might help her sleep," she said quietly. "I just wanted her to sleep. I'm so tired." Dr. Patterson left the house and went directly to the police. An investigation was opened immediately. The police questioned Walter Stanway, the chemist's assistant who had dispensed the bottle. He was horrified to discover his mistake. He insisted it had been an accident, that he had grabbed the wrong bottle in his haste. He showed the police how similar the bottles were, how easy it would be to confuse them. The police believed him. He was young, inexperienced, and clearly devastated by what had happened. He was reprimanded, but not charged with a crime. Accidental poisonings from mislabeled or misidentified medicines were tragically common in the Victorian era. But the question remained, Did Elizabeth know the bottle contained poison? And if so, had she given it to her baby deliberately? The police questioned Elizabeth extensively. Her answers were confused and contradictory. Sometimes she insisted she had thought it was gripe water. Other times she said things that suggested she had known something was wrong with the bottle, but had given it anyway, hoping it would calm the baby. While this investigation was ongoing, something else happened that made the police far more suspicious of Elizabeth Barry. On January 10th, just 6 days after baby Harriet's death, Thomas Barry fell violently ill. He complained of severe stomach pain, nausea, and dizziness. The symptoms came on suddenly. Shortly after eating dinner that Elizabeth had prepared, Thomas was taken to the hospital, where doctors worked to save his life. They suspected poisoning immediately and pumped his stomach. They found traces of phosphorus and other deadly poison. This one, commonly found in rat poison and matches. Thomas survived, but the experience left him weak and traumatized. And when questioned by police, he admitted something that shocked investigators. This wasn't the first time he'd been mysteriously ill. Over the past few months, he'd experienced several episodes of stomach pain and sickness, always after eating food Elizabeth had prepared. He had attributed it to bad food or his own weak digestion. But now, with the doctors telling him he'd been poisoned, he had to face a terrible truth. His wife had been trying to kill him. Elizabeth Barry was arrested on January 12, 1887, and charged with the murder of her infant daughter Harriet and the attempted murder of her husband Thomas. She was taken to Oldham Police Station, where she was questioned for hours by detectives trying to understand why a mother would poison her own child. What emerged from those interrogations was a portrait of a woman at the absolute end of her endurance. Elizabeth described the grinding poverty, the constant worry about money, the exhaustion of caring for children in such difficult circumstances. She talked about the nights spent awake with a crying baby, the desperation when nothing she did seemed to help, the feeling that she was trapped in a life with no escape. When asked directly if she had poisoned Harriet deliberately, Elizabeth's answer was both confession and plea. "I knew something was wrong with the medicine. I could tell it wasn't right. But I was so tired. So tired. I just wanted her to sleep. I wanted peace. Just one night of peace." Her tone, witnesses later reported, was eerily calm. She wasn't weeping or hysterical. She spoke as if she were describing something ordinary, something anyone would understand. And perhaps, in her exhausted mind, it was ordinary. It was simply the solution to an unbearable problem. When asked about Thomas, Elizabeth was less forthcoming. She initially denied trying to poison him. But when confronted with the evidence the phosphorus found in his stomach, the pattern of illness after eating her food, she eventually admitted that she had been putting small amounts of rat poison in his meals. Why? The answer was chillingly practical. If Thomas died, there would be insurance money, she explained. The burial society would pay out. It would be enough to get me and Edith out of that house, away from that life. We could start over somewhere better. The police were stunned. Elizabeth wasn't a woman driven by rage or passion. She was a woman making cold, calculated decisions about who should live and who should die based on economic necessity. But there was something else, something even more disturbing. When police searched the Barry home, they found evidence that made them question whether baby Harriet was Elizabeth's first victim. Among Elizabeth's belongings, they found death certificates for her 3 children who had died in previous years. The causes listed were typical fever, respiratory illness, natural causes. But the symptoms described in the doctor's notes were eerily similar to what had happened to Harriet. Gastric distress, convulsions, sudden death. Had those deaths been natural? Or had Elizabeth been poisoning her children for years? The police quietly exhumed the bodies of the 3 deceased children. Post-mortem examinations were conducted, and tissue samples were analyzed for poisons. The results were inconclusive. The bodies had been buried for years. The tissue degraded. Some traces of substances were found, but not enough to definitively prove poisoning. Without clear evidence, the police couldn't charge Elizabeth with those earlier deaths. But the suspicion remained, and it colored how the public viewed her trial. Elizabeth Barry's trial began on March 14, 1887, at Liverpool Assizes. The courtroom was packed with spectators, many of them women. Some came out of curiosity, wanting to see the woman who had killed her own baby. Others came seeking understanding, perhaps recognizing in Elizabeth's desperation a shadow of their own struggles. The prosecution presented a straightforward case. Elizabeth had obtained poison, either knowingly or through criminal negligence. She had administered it to her baby daughter, causing the child's death. She had then tried to poison her husband for financial gain. She was guilty of murder and attempted murder. The defense had a more difficult task. Elizabeth's own statements had essentially confessed to the crimes. But her attorney, a man named Mr. Cottingham, attempted to argue that Elizabeth's mental state was so compromised by exhaustion, poverty, and stress that she could not be held fully responsible for her actions. He painted a picture of a woman ground down by circumstances beyond her control. He described the conditions in which she lived, the poverty, the infant mortality, the constant labor, the isolation. He brought medical experts who testified about puerperal psychosis and exhaustion-induced mental breaks. He argued that Elizabeth had not committed premeditated murder, but had acted in a state of diminished capacity, unable to fully understand or control what she was doing. But the prosecution countered effectively. It pointed out that Elizabeth had obtained the poison, had administered it, and had later tried to poison her husband in a completely separate incident. These were not the actions of someone in a temporary mental break. These were calculated acts by someone who knew exactly what she was doing. The trial lasted 3 days. The jury deliberated for just over an hour before returning a verdict: guilty of murder in the death of Harriet Barry and guilty of attempted murder of Thomas Barry. The judge, Justice Charles, delivered a grave sentencing statement. He acknowledged the difficult circumstances of Elizabeth's life, but stated firmly that poverty and exhaustion could not excuse the deliberate taking of an innocent life. He noted that if such excuses were accepted, no child in the slums of England would be safe from desperate mothers. He sentenced Elizabeth Barry to death by hanging. Elizabeth showed little reaction to the sentence. She simply nodded, as if she had expected nothing else. As she was led from the courtroom, she asked only one question: who will care for Edith? Her surviving daughter was taken into the care of Thomas Barry's family, who wanted nothing to do with Elizabeth, but accepted responsibility for the child. Elizabeth was transported to Walton jail in Liverpool to await execution. She was held in the condemned cell, a small stone room furnished only with a bed, a table, and a chair. A female warder watched her constantly to ensure she didn't attempt suicide. The prison chaplain, Reverend John Davies, visited Elizabeth daily. In his journal, which was later published, he described their conversations as some of the most disturbing he'd experienced in his 20 years of ministry. Elizabeth was not defiant. She didn't claim innocence or rail against her fate, but neither did she show what Reverend Davies considered genuine remorse. She spoke of Harriet's death as if it had been a regrettable necessity, something that had to be done to bring peace to an unbearable situation. "You don't understand what it's like," she told him during one visit. "Night after night, no sleep. The baby crying and crying, and nothing helps. And you know it will be like this for months, maybe years. And there's no escape, no relief. Just endless days of the same suffering. I gave her peace, and I gave myself peace. Was that so wrong? Reverend Davies tried to help Elizabeth understand the magnitude of what she had done, to feel the grief and guilt that should accompany such an act. But Elizabeth seemed unable or unwilling to access those feelings. Modern psychologists who have studied the case suggest that Elizabeth may have been suffering from what we now recognize as severe postpartum depression or psychosis, possibly compounded by chronic sleep deprivation and situational depression caused by poverty. In this state, her ability to feel normal human emotions, including maternal love and empathy, may have been severely compromised. But in 1887, such diagnoses didn't exist. Elizabeth was simply labeled as a cold, unnatural woman who had committed an unnatural crime. Public opinion was divided. Many called for her execution, seeing her as a monster who had betrayed the sacred bond between mother and child. But others, particularly some women's groups, argued for clemency, pointing out that Elizabeth was as much a victim of her circumstances as her children were victims of her actions. Petitions were circulated calling for her sentence to be commuted to life imprisonment. Some argued that executing a woman for infanticide set a dangerous precedent. Others pointed out that if Elizabeth had been wealthy enough to afford help a nursemaid, a doctor, proper nutrition, none of this would have happened. But the Home Secretary, reviewing the case, found no grounds for mercy. The crime was too severe, the evidence too clear, and the need to deter similar acts too important. The execution would proceed as scheduled on March 14, 1887, exactly 3 months after baby Harriet's death. Elizabeth Barry was awakened at 6 a.m. in her cell at Walton Jail. She was given breakfast, which she barely touched. Reverend Davies came for a final prayer, which Elizabeth participated in with the same flat, distant affect she'd shown throughout her imprisonment. At 8 a.m. she was led from her cell to the execution chamber. A crowd of several hundred had gathered outside the prison walls, as was common for executions. When the black flag was raised to signal the execution had been carried out, some in the crowd cheered. Others stood in silent reflection. Elizabeth walked to the scaffold calmly. The executioner, James Barry, no relation, later described her as one of the most composed prisoners I ever dealt with. She showed no fear, no distress, no emotion at all. When asked if she had any final words, Elizabeth spoke briefly. I did what I thought was right. I wanted peace. That's all. Peace. The hood was placed over her head. The noose was tightened around her neck. And at 8:04 a.m., the trapdoor opened. Elizabeth Barry died instantly. She was 30 years old. Her body was buried within the prison grounds, as was customary for executed criminals. No marker was placed. No memorial acknowledged her existence. But the questions her case raised did not die with her. The Elizabeth Barry case sparked significant debate in Victorian Britain about several uncomfortable topics: maternal mental health, the pressures of poverty, the availability of poisons, and the question of when desperation becomes criminality. Newspapers covered the case extensively, though many refused to print Elizabeth's full testimony, considering it too disturbing for public consumption. The parts they did publish sparked outrage and, in some quarters, unexpected sympathy. Some editorial writers condemned Elizabeth as an unnatural monster, but others posed difficult questions. What drove a woman to such an act? What responsibility did society bear for creating conditions so desperate that mothers saw death as preferable to life? Medical professionals began to take more seriously the concept of puerperal insanity, mental illness following childbirth. While the condition had been recognized for years, it had been poorly understood and rarely used as a legal defense. The Barry case prompted more research into postpartum mental health and its potential to drive otherwise normal women to desperate acts. The case also led to reforms in how poisons were sold. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 had already imposed some restrictions on poison sales, but enforcement was lax and loopholes were common. After the Berry case and several similar incidents, regulations were tightened significantly. Sellers had to keep detailed records. Buyers had to provide identification and sign a poison book. And certain substances could only be sold to people with legitimate professional needs. The role of the chemist's assistant, Walter Stanway, also came under scrutiny. His mistake, giving out zinc sulfate instead of gripe water, had been the catalyst for the tragedy. The pharmaceutical industry began implementing better labeling systems, storage protocols, and training requirements to prevent similar errors. But perhaps the most significant impact of the Berry case was on how Victorian society viewed motherhood itself. The prevailing narrative had been that mothers instinctively loved their children, that maternal feelings were natural and universal. The idea that a mother could be so exhausted, so desperate, so mentally compromised that she would kill her own child challenged that comfortable assumption. Some women began speaking more openly about the difficulties of motherhood, the exhaustion, the isolation, the overwhelming responsibility. Organizations began forming to provide support to struggling mothers. Though these efforts were limited and often ineffective given the scale of poverty in Victorian cities, what happened to the surviving members of Elizabeth's family provides a sad coda to the story. Thomas Berry, having survived his wife's poisoning attempts, struggled to rebuild his life. He was traumatized by the revelation that his wife had been trying to kill him, and he never fully trusted anyone again. He remarried in 1890, but the marriage was reportedly unhappy. He died in 1903, relatively young, of what was described as a wasting illness. Edith Berry, the surviving daughter, was raised by Thomas's sister. The stigma of being the poisoner's daughter followed her throughout her life. She took her aunt's surname and moved to another city as soon as she was old enough, trying to escape her mother's shadow. She never married and died in 1945, having lived a quiet, solitary life. The house at 1 back George Lee Street, where the Berry family had lived, became infamous. No one wanted to rent it. Eventually, it was torn down along with the surrounding slum housing during urban renewal projects in the early 1900s. Chemist shop where the fatal bottle was dispensed continued operating for several years. But Walter Stanway never worked as a chemist again. The guilt of his mistake, even though it had been ruled accidental, destroyed him. He became an alcoholic and died in 1895, aged just 32. And what of baby Harriet, the innocent victim at the center of this tragedy? She was buried in an unmarked grave in a pauper section of Oldham Cemetery. Her death certificate lists the cause as poisoning by zinc sulfate. No epitaph. No memorial. Just another dead baby in a city where dead babies were all too common. In recent years, historians have attempted to piece together a fuller picture of Elizabeth Berry's life, looking for warning signs that might have been missed, circumstances that might have prevented the tragedy. What they found is a woman who was, in many ways, utterly ordinary, shaped by her environment, struggling with circumstances beyond her control, and ultimately breaking under pressures that many women of her era faced but somehow survived. Was Elizabeth Berry a monster? Or was she a desperate woman pushed beyond her breaking point by circumstances that would have broken many others? The question has no easy answer. Both things can be true simultaneously. I spent time in the archives in Manchester and Oldham researching this case, reading through court transcripts, newspaper accounts, and the personal journals of those involved. What struck me most was how contemporary Elizabeth's desperation feels. Despite the 137 years that separate us from her crime, even today, maternal mental health is poorly understood and inadequately supported. Postpartum depression and psychosis still go undiagnosed and untreated. Mothers still struggle with exhaustion, isolation, and the overwhelming pressure to be perfect caregivers. And poverty still creates circumstances where people make desperate, terrible choices. We've made progress since Elizabeth Barry's time. We have better mental health resources, better social support systems, better understanding of what drives people to such extreme acts. But we haven't solved the fundamental problems that made her crime possible. The Elizabeth Barry case asks us to hold two truths in tension: that she committed an unforgivable crime, and that the circumstances that drove her to it were created by a society that failed her, and millions of others, like her. She was responsible for her actions. But she was also a victim of a system that ground down the poor with relentless cruelty, that offered no support to struggling mothers, that provided no outlet for mental health crisis, and that made poison more accessible than help. This is not to excuse what Elizabeth did. Nothing can excuse the murder of an innocent child. But understanding the context doesn't diminish accountability. It enhances it. It forces us to acknowledge that preventing such crimes requires more than just punishing perpetrators. It requires building systems that support people before they reach the breaking point. Elizabeth Barry's final words haunt me. I did what I thought was right. I wanted peace. They reveal a mind so compromised, so exhausted, that murder seemed like a reasonable solution to suffering. They show us how far a human being can fall when circumstances strip away their humanity piece by piece. This has been the story of Elizabeth Barry, a mother who killed for peace, a woman executed for a crime that was enabled by the society that condemned her, a case that forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about responsibility, desperation, and the breaking point of the human mind. Thank you for listening to this difficult episode of Dark Case Files. Stories like this are hard to tell and harder to hear, but they're necessary. They remind us why mental health support matters, why social safety nets are essential, why we can never assume that people are okay just because they seem to be coping. If you made it through this entire episode, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss future cases. And please, share this video, not for shock value, but to spark conversations about maternal mental health, poverty, and the systems that either support or fail the most vulnerable. Leave a comment and tell me, how has our understanding of maternal mental health changed since 1887? What more needs to be done to support struggling parents? Where is the line between understanding circumstances and holding people accountable for their actions? And if you or someone you know is struggling with postpartum depression, exhaustion, or thoughts of harming yourself or others, please reach out for help. These resources didn't exist in Elizabeth Barry's time, but they exist now. Use them. Rest in peace, Harriet Barry. You deserved a mother who could love and protect you, circumstances that would have allowed that love to flourish, and a society that valued your life enough to prevent your death. Your brief life mattered, and you will not be forgotten. Until next time, stay compassionate, stay aware of those who are struggling, and never forget, the most dangerous moments in human life are when people lose hope that anything can get better. This has been Dark Case Files. I'm your host, and the tragedy of Elizabeth Barry reminds us that monsters are often made, not born, and that preventing their creation is all our responsibility. If you're struggling, reach out. If you see someone struggling, offer help. Because the difference between survival and tragedy can be as simple as one person who cares enough to notice.